Good morning, good afternoon to people joining from all over the world. Great that you're here for this webinar organized by Foresight-driven Food and the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford. My name is Bram. I work as facilitator for this initiative, and welcome to everyone joining us for a session on foresight and economic benefits of food system transformation. So we have people still coming into the room. We're about to start, so settle in and note that we will be recording the session, as you will have seen upon entering this room. We have a very nice session here today with you, with also Dr. Stephen Lord, who's with us in the session to also share his insights with us. And we're looking forward to that as well. Before we get into it, I would like to just briefly introduce the Foresight for Food initiative. So this is an initiative that is a global network of different stakeholders and organizations that are all interested in using foresight and scenario analysis for food system change. It's a combination of different international agencies, research institutes, funders, food systems initiatives, and providers and users of foresight. And we're all about talking about building capacities, enhancing capacities to use foresight and scenario analysis. It's about linking participatory processes and quantitative modeling, and also sharing of cases and backgrounds and experiences at different country level and regional level. So welcoming everyone again. So the people who just entered the room, we're about to begin for this session on foresight and the economic benefits of food system transformation. The build-up of the session is a welcome and a bit of question to you to warm you up and to get you already thinking about the theme of this session. We'll be setting the scene a little bit, and I'm doing that also now. But then the biggest and the most important aspect of this webinar is the keynote by Dr. Stephen Lord. Welcome. This is about foresight and the hidden costs of food systems, and that really talks to the importance of understanding those costs in order for us to also understand why it is beneficial to already transform now rather than wait. And after that presentation, we'll have a response by Dr. Monica Zurek from Foresight for Food and University of Oxford to react to that, and also to put it a bit in the light of, how can we really use foresight approaches to tackle these big questions. We will have an interactive breakout group with you. We will also challenge you and have you engage with your fellows from across the world to talk about how we can understand the big barriers that are stopping change from happening, and also see how we can use foresight to unlock that transformation. We'll have a plenary discussion at the close, and then we have a wrap up. So the session is about 1.5 hours, so welcome you to join us for the whole discussion, and we think it will be very rich. So I would like to ask my colleagues to open up with the first warm-up question. We'll have a Mentimeter, so you can also use Mentimeter in Zoom and add your responses there. And you may also, in case of not being able to access Mentimeter, you can also write your answers in the chat, and we'll also reflect on that. So just to get you going, let's have the first question. And we'll use a word cloud for this. You can type a few keywords in answer to this question. So if you see on the right-hand screen, you will get an invitation to use a Zoom app, a Mentimeter app in Zoom. So you will be able to join that guest mode and start typing also your answers. And the first question is, what do you think, what are the future costs of the food system? So think about what you think this might be, and try to answer a few keywords that come to mind on this topic. This is really at the center of what we'll be discussing today, and Stephen will also be talking to this in his presentation as well. But I'd like to ask you to think a bit for yourself and answer that in the chat. All right, the first answers are already coming in, so that's great. Health costs, environmental costs, and social costs are already typed in the chat. Yeah, excellent. So indeed, this feeds into, for instance, ideas about what could be the consequences of, for instance, obesity on society and non-communicable diseases. I see more elements now coming in, so feel free to just enter the chat. It's anonymous. You can just fill it in as you go. There's plenty of time to learn and talk about this more. I see animal suffering is also coming in. Extinction, it's a big topic, and I'd say a huge cost as well. If human beings are extinct, I guess, if that's but maybe that's extinction of different, but biodiversity related. I see more answers coming in now. Malnutrition, hunger malnutrition is being mentioned as well. Poverty is a future cost. It's an existing cost already, but it's also perhaps a future cost. I see conflict is now coming in as well, decreasing soil health. Let's have a few more answers coming in. I see Moses, you're writing in the chat, food insecurity. Yep. So, I mean, these are existing costs as well, but likely, according to projections, will continue to exist perhaps. Intergenerational legacy. So this is an interesting one. This is really talking about future generations and how they might perceive our current actions as a human society. There's more coming in. Healthcare cost is still up front as a big one. Biodiversity is coming in. Water scarcity, I see, is a new one. Supply chain, not exactly sure about the cost element there, but I mean, for sure, the cost of trade and the aspects of trade will also be perhaps relevant as well. So let's have a few more coming in. Let's see. I see there's climate change as a massive one. Green jobs. Yep. I think that's definitely a huge topic. That's, you know, the big elephant in the room. How do we deal with climate change in the face of existing emissions, as well as the future state of the food system? I see fuel costs are coming in. I see that's probably linked to energy as well. Like how do we create energy? Global trade disruptions. All right, so these are big questions and big topics coming in. It's going all over the place in terms of different aspects of it. So I think that also shows how the food system is in a way impacting a lot of these different costs. So thanks everyone for generating these answers. And I think this is a really good start to already thinking, like, what is the topic of this session about? And it's really about understanding not just the current, but also perhaps the hidden costs, as well as the future costs that also might lead to in the future. So thanks to all who have been adding their comments here. I see carbon neutralization is being added, unemployment. I mean, these are very interesting points to explore. So I would like to request the next question to come up. And here it's about, what do you think are the biggest barriers that make it difficult to transform food systems? And I'd like to challenge you a little bit to think about this from an economic perspective here as well, right? Because that's also the topic of this webinar, is why is it so difficult to change the way our systems are working, in terms of also the way that our food system is being shaped from an economic perspective as well. And I think that's the big question that we want to be exploring here. So first answers are coming in. Lack of systems thinking. So we're talking about the fact that, you know, people are maybe focusing on particular sectors only, or, you know, having a narrow perspective perhaps on their own businesses, etc. Orchestration of transformation, policymakers. Okay, so someone is saying policymakers are the ones who are making it difficult to transform food systems. That's an interesting one. Cost of new technologies is being mentioned. Yeah, so basically saying, well, there are different ideas about technologies who could help, and basically scaling those technologies, getting those technologies to be active is costly. Very good. We're having new things coming into the chat. That's great. Oh yeah, okay. So welcome, Edward. Yeah, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, because I think that's also a good point. Just feel free to introduce yourself and your background as we go into the discussion. So lack of systems thinking, I already said. Primacy of GDP growth. I think this is a very critical point, and I think Stephen will also be addressing this as well in the discussion, in the presentation. Habits, ingrained habits of how human beings interact, how our societies work, and yeah, it's very difficult to break habits. That could be definitely an important point, and I think the behavioral comment is part of that as well. Climate change is mentioned, cultural issues, perceptions of change, consumer habits. Yeah, that also probably relates to sort of the fact that it's difficult to change a habit and difficult to perhaps go to more healthy diets, for instance. Yeah, so these are really great points, and maybe there's a few more coming in. Yes, exactly. We see that people are only thinking in terms of growth or economic growth, and not so much about the ecosystem health or planetary health. Political action, lack of political action, perhaps indeed here. Yeah, very good points. Okay, so thanks everyone. I think this is really great. This really shows already some different perspectives that we can take into our listening here and also our sharing as we move on. So thanks for this, and thank you, Arfa, for having this this Menti. So before we go into the presentation, I'd just like to sort of give some bit of setting the scene of how we are coming into this, and just to share my screen again. We will think a little bit about this in terms of foresight, right? So this is all about trying to come at this topic, which is a complex topic, and we're coming at it from a futures perspective and a foresight perspective. And what I'd like to just raise with you is that there is this concept, and it's been raised already in 2015 about the tragedy of the horizon. And this is a concept that was actually coined by Mark Carney, who was then governor of the Bank of England, who talked about it in relation to climate change, saying that the catastrophic impacts of climate change will be felt beyond the traditional horizons of most actors, imposing a cost on future generations that the current generation has no direct incentive to fix. And this is really about saying, well, actually, we don't have the ability to think ahead far enough collectively that we're able to take action together also then collectively to tackle this now, because all those problems are in the future and therefore perhaps not relevant on a short time scale. And yet, what he also says is that the more we invest with foresight, the less we'll regret in hindsight. And I think that's just something that we can take along while we're listening to this discussion, and perhaps think about how we can create that urgency, create that horizon to come forward and to create an urgency for change on the short term. And I think the story that Stephen will tell is really important for that. So just to remind you some of the questions that we want to be tackling throughout this webinar. What do we know about the hidden costs of our current food system? What are the implications of this? How can we use foresight approaches to support food system stakeholders to take action now, anticipatory action now, rather than wait for just change to happen? And then finally, what are some examples of scenarios that have already been developed that share this story and that estimate benefits of change, and how will this help stakeholders to change course, particularly perhaps in finance, public and private sectors? So that's just a bit of setting the scene for our presentation, and I'd like to just then by this invite Dr. Stephen. He's a senior researcher working on food systems economic modeling at the University of Oxford, and we are in the same food group there. So I'm really happy that he's been willing to prepare this presentation for us. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to you, Stephen.
Okay, I will share. Okay, so hopefully the presentation is up. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Foresight for Food, for the invitation. I just want to acknowledge some of the funding which has produced this work and given it its background over the past 7 to 8 years. So there's funders for an initiative called Food City. There's funders for the Food System Economic Commission. There's the FAO. There is some contribution from the European Union Horizon 2020 program. So I just want to acknowledge the diversity of funders that sort of have built this work up to where it is at the moment in terms of being a feature of the State of Food and Agriculture reports by the FAO. So what I want to do in this talk is try and create that link. First, an understanding of hidden costs and why they're connected to the future, and then what their interaction with foresight. So what are hidden costs from food systems? And the basic assessment ideas, some examples of those assessments for some modeled food system transformations to 2050. What are the implications of these hidden costs for economic corrections, for funding food system transformation, and elements like trade? And then a connection to foresight. Foresight, where it is used in hidden costs, and where from this idea of hidden costs, you can get a richer foresight exercise. So what are hidden costs? So I'll go through this quickly because many of us know about food systems. So we know about the biophysical effects of agri-food production. We have the greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions with the major gases are involved in the food system, and they have a global effect. We have nitrogen emissions, ammonia, nitrogen oxides. We have runoff of nitrate into waterways, into soil, and the food system is the primary source of those types of emissions. We have blue water consumption, stats we know, long time used from the FAO, and we have land use transitions, and bearing on the estimates or the reports you look at, the food system is probably the major contributor to habitat loss. We also have biophysical effects from consumption. We have obesity, diabetes, leading to cardiovascular disease. We have hunger, protein, energy, malnutrition, where there's various forms of micronutrient deficiencies. And the food system is, again, a major contributor. The estimates from the global burden of disease put it about 1/3 of preventable disease and death in the world at the moment. So the biophysical effects impact human and natural capital now. So from your current year of your food system activities, your emissions, your consumption, those biophysical effects impact human and natural capital now and into the future. And those effects will reflect back into future economies. Your climate costs go for a long time. What you emit now, you well know, contributes to radiative forcing for a long time. For methane, it's short. The average is about 12 years before it's broken down. But for CO2 and N2O, you are talking about centuries of a contribution of forcing, radiative forcing from today's emission. You also have things like productivity losses from unhealthy diets, and also from human health impacts from air pollution, from those nitrogen emissions. They occur from now within the next 5 years. They contribute to comorbidities, and then they become primary morbidities, potentially through cancers and other disease outcomes within a 20 to 30 year time span. And then you have short-term nitrogen loading affecting ecosystem services now, and you have the long-term losses from removing a rich habitat with all of its established ecosystem services from the present, from this current activity, if you were to lose that habitat in this year. So if you look at the asymmetry there, you might see here is the connection with foresight. You have the benefits to the system counted in things like gross value add, gross product of the activities of the food system counted in this year, but you have this very long tail of costs from those activities, and there's quite an asymmetry between what you count now, which is all in one hit, only counted for 1 year, and these costs, which aren't as large, but when you look at aggregating them up, especially because you are incurring these costs year on year. Year on year, you're taking out a little bit of a loan on future human and natural capital. And eventually, if you take out this loan year after year, you will start to accumulate quite a deficit and a liability over time. And as you accumulate and you don't record these costs or know how large they are or take into account how to remove them, they can add up, and essentially your human and natural creditors can come knocking on your door and on your economy into the future. This United Nations system of national accounts by definition, it's actually in the definition of national accounts, but it does not subtract the liability of damage to human natural capital from gross product in the future. So unlike accounting for a business that has something called forward liabilities, we don't have that for nations. Your benefits of your food production and consumption activities, they get recorded in these economic indicators, but these types of future liabilities to future product from activities now, they don't get recorded. And that's what we mean by hidden costs. It means, well, our definition and our use of hidden costs as a macroeconomic issue in the studies that we've been doing, we mean this loss of potential GDP from all of these byproducts of food production and consumption. The greenhouse gas emissions, the nitrogen pollution, the habitat loss, we know them well as impacts of the food system. So the issue of having hidden costs is, besides having skewed views of efficiency and value add, is you can appear to be very efficient right now because you are just putting all of your costs into the future and they're not accounted for. So you can look quite efficient, or if you take into account those costs, that the situation can and the calculation can change. And as a major sort of macroeconomic risk is this liability is growing and it has the potential to grow faster than the capacity to absorb or abate those costs. And that's where you will see your growth and your GVA from agriculture, from climate change sort of tailoring off. And that is a macroeconomic risk. So to just change the framings, because there's a lot of issues, we're just saying here is where it is bad. There are all of these costs. Just to change the framing around to the benefits from avoiding these costs. If you change the annual activities of the agri-food system, if you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, etc., then you avoid these future costs. You reduce this deficit and this loan on the future you're taking out. You're reducing your risk to development and growth, and you're increasing your potential product into the future. So who are the beneficiaries? It is society as a whole. Most of our calculations that you'll see are not for individual groups in society, but for a very simple measure of social welfare, which is an aggregate across all individuals in society. When are these benefits received? And an important thing to realize is they are dispersed in time due to all these multiple biophysical processes attached to food system outcomes. And they originate from the present. That's what we're measuring. What type of benefits? Well, as mentioned, we have this reduced air pollution. So there are all sorts of changes to human capital and natural capital over different timescales and potentially dispersed across borders from the original pollution or activity. So what is the basic assessment idea? For hidden costs, just so you can see, I won't go into this too much. You have these sort of quantities which are associated with these biophysical effects that get reabsorbed into future economies. And then you look at that level of that sort of effect on a future economy as a unit cost. So you can get that from various studies, or you can do what we did, is try and make a consistent model amongst all of those costs so they all work on the same discount rate. And so there's a lot of consistency between them. So yeah, because there's obviously multiple quantities associated to impact from the food system. An important concept also is this idea of marginality. They're called marginal hidden costs or marginal damage costs. And what that means is the cost of one more unit. But it's important to realize for foresight and for understanding hidden costs is what is the quantity we're talking about as changing, one more unit to what? So examples of these hidden costs being marginal, like social cost of CO2. It's not to the CO2 you emitted this year. What is causing the harm and the damage is the stock, the total stock from past to the current emissions. And your damages will change because that CO2 is in the air for several centuries. Your damages will change depending upon also the future emission trajectory. For something like ammonia, it's just not the ammonia emissions. how much particulate matter is formed, how much deposition of ammonia you get on ecosystems from it going to the air from manure or fertilizer. This actually depends on background rates of other forms of pollution, like nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides. There is a stock of nitrate in the vadose zone. That's the zone before you get to the water table. So what you add to nitrate now to the soil could impact into the future for many years. And there is the current and recent flux of nitrogen. So nitrogen loading on ecosystems, so they're stressed by the amount of nitrogen, and you get biodiversity effects like eutrophication or otherwise. So these are the type of quantities and stocks that we mean by marginal to. And why that's important is because even though you might have had an emission in the past few years, its cost is actually undetermined at the moment. If the future looks like, say, SSP1 under radiative forcing RCP 2.4, then the actual cost of this emission that occurred in the past is actually 50% or more less than the same emission if the future looks like SSP5 with a very high radiative forcing scenario. Same with methane, and this is where the marginality changes over the timescales that we're interested in with foresight. You can assume they're constant, say, over a 5-year time span, but over decades, these costs can change, and they can change a lot. Because methane's contribution mostly to damages from temperature depends on the current atmospheric stock of CO2 and N2O, it adds on to the background warming and makes it more dangerous. So the social cost of methane in the 1950s, when the temperature anomaly was about 0 and the methane was causing radiative forcing for about 12 years and might have contributed for it from going to 0 to 0.1 degrees anomaly, that's a near zero social cost. But now, 70 years later, the same metric ton of methane put into the atmosphere has a much greater social cost, definitely non-zero. In fact, per ton, per weight of gas, not in CO2 equivalents, but per weight of gas, the social cost of methane is about 30 times more expensive than a ton of CO2. So that gives you an example how the costs actually change over time, which if you're thinking about foresight, then you start to see some of the implications. And you all know Schrodinger's cat, it could be in a superposition of alive or dead, you don't know. And some of these costs have this irreducible uncertainty, which is what we face with foresight. Like I said, for the CO2 emission that has been emitted into the atmosphere a few years ago, we don't actually know the cost of that until the future unfolds. So it's like a bit of a Schrodinger cost. And also marginality is important for communication. I just wanted to mention this because, in economics, this marginal idea is very important because it's not that things are good or bad by themselves. So that ton of gas by itself is not good or bad. It's the context it's in which makes it good or bad for societal and future economic impacts. And that translates into something like, a kilogram of beef on your plate. It by itself is not good or bad. It by itself has nutrition in it. But the question is that nutrition marginal to the nutrition that is already provided to that society? And like we said, 70 years ago, the methane might have had not much impact, but in the current context of climate change, then the same product translated 70 years later with the same emissions potentially attached to it, they are more consequential. So things are not good or bad except in the context of the total stock, and that can be an important and powerful communication tool when talking about these costs, because you don't have to split into this binary good or bad. Just before we get into these exercises, how to understand when we're talking about costs that can be spread across space and time, we have to make them commensurate so that we can add them up So we have to have some way of comparing the cost across two economies. We use purchasing power for that, which is better than just using exchange rates, which is only really a comparison of financial capital, as opposed to a comparison. It's a very limited welfare measure, but it is a useful one, and that is purchasing power. And we also have to use social discount rate to compare the impact or the purchasing power in the future with the present to get some estimate of the damage cost bearing across generations. So there's a lot to say about that, but I won't get into it in terms of technicalities, implications, sensitivity analysis, etc. But we have to do that so that we have this standard economic unit because things are so dispersed. So the unit is this cost in the equivalent loss of purchasing power in 2020. Once you do that, you can aggregate these impacts across time and space. And all of these unit costs are calculated in that so that the total cost, when you multiply them by the units, are in this measure of called or denoted 2020 PPP. And the final thing before we look at this, yes, you can divide some of these costs up. They're not necessarily by health in terms of health impacts, because those environmental sources of external costs can have health impacts like air pollution in them. So what these blue, red, and green, and this was explained in the State of Food and Agriculture 2023, they're really about more categorizing the source of the failure to produce or account for these hidden costs. So there are things in economics called classic externalities or technological externalities. These are the external costs from some of these environmental pollutants, and then these institutional or imperfect information that leads to some of these future impacts from consumption. And nobody can make a perfect classification of these. So there's ways you can look at overlaps between what is a social component and what is an environmental component, even in terms of its source of failure. But it's just a useful classification as opposed to being correct or perfect. So we've got enough. We can look at examples of avoiding hidden costs and get some idea of the size and magnitude of some of the costs we're talking about. So the main one I'll talk about is this example of a Food System Economic Commission, global economic benefits of dietary change, and a shout out to all of the collaborators in FSEC. This certainly wasn't a solo effort of ours, but we were one of the modelling team that could add this cost analysis to the effort. So we're going to talk just about something called the diet scenario, which was just a what-if scenario. What if by 2050 you could translate to eating globally this planetary health diet? And I think most of you know the components for that, but I'll give you a chance to read, and some form of appropriate. That gives you the sort of proportions of your dietary intake at the appropriate caloric intake for most individuals, including a removal of underweight individuals. So SDG 2 is achieved in this diet scenario. And then there was economic modeling involved. So this what if people were having this diet, that is a change in demand up to 2050. This baseline that was modeled was the current trends. It wasn't a worst case scenario at all. It was a projection forward of expected policy changes. So there were current national commitments were involved in there. Commitments to reforestation or afforestation of countries were all assumed in this current trend. The baseline, yes, it's an SSP2. It has all these current trajectories, and the baseline with this demand change is called diet. It was modeled by the Magpie model at Potsdam. It could give us these quantity changes. And the important thing to note is when you change demand, you both get consumption and production changes. So this shows you the difference in the hidden costs for the year of the emissions over 2020 to 2050 as you're changing between these two scenarios. It gives you an idea of the difference between them in favor of diet. So you have the avoided hidden costs is this total area. The amount by 2050 is about 4 trillion, which is about 3% of that global GDP in that year projected. And the average cost was about 2.6 trillion. And the uncertainty you see is there was modeled uncertainty in all of these different costs. Just to sort of put that in context, that avoided liability of the future of about an average of 2.6 trillion over those 30 years would actually be the equivalent to the product of the 7th largest economy in the world being there for 30 years. So that is a sizable contribution, and that is a sizable deficit between the diet and the CT scenario in terms of those hidden costs and what you could avoid. Just a quick breakdown. Obviously, with a diet scenario, you do have a large component of labor productivity gains, but you also get a sizable component of environmental change from reducing so many animal products. And in fact, that is about 50% of the full scenario where there were lots of production measures in total. So dietary change was quite a sizable lever in terms of the full avoided costs. Just quickly by income group, you see that this scenario is not the absolute cost numbers, but the relative avoided costs compared to the group's GDP in high to low income. And you can see once you put it in that sense, it is low income countries that are bearing most of this GDP deficit. And you see that in terms of health or impacts, it is not just beneficial for high income countries. There is almost an equal contribution or benefit to across the income groups. And there are some reasons that I won't go into why you see low income countries bearing such a disproportionate cost from those environmental costs, including the cost to them of climate change. Just another example of an analysis we did, very similar, was the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network. They did a multi-country case study as part of the State of Food and Agriculture 2024. They have coordinate something called the FABLE Consortium. They do, just for interest in foresight, they do something called a Cenathon, and about 24 national teams are involved in that process, and they come up with pathways for their own agri-food system futures under that process. So about 6 countries were included in this study, just to concentrate on Australia. The main aspects that were examined were this global sustainability versus the current national commitments versus the current trends, and then some of these other levers inside that. And you see again, the main sort of story was the greater potential for avoiding hidden costs from greater sustainability efforts than the current national commitments trend. But again, dietary change was a major driver, but there was high uncertainty in the Australian context for the value of the ecosystem services restored in semi-arid rangeland. So it's part of an analysis. It's back to the country teams to check those sorts of values for their own context and create another iteration of the analysis. But the same conclusion held even when that sort of check or adjustment was done. Finally, the Swiss Vision 2050, another example. It's not released yet, so it's all blurred out. The Swiss federal government contracted a national agency to model a 2050 strategy, conduct a hidden cost analysis about it. The interesting thing about this study, and why I'm mentioning it, because they extended their scope to imports, which for Switzerland is about over 50% of their calories. So there is, in consideration of imports, that the greenhouse gas emission, the nitrogen emissions, the land use change is actually being borne, those costs are being borne by the producer country for benefits of consumption in the consuming country. And a similar sort of analysis you can do Again, it's not just a story, even though there was large dietary change involved, it's not just a story of health benefits, but they're in mixed environmental and health sort of sources of hidden cost reduction. And the interesting one is that the share of production of hidden costs borne by those producer countries for Swiss consumption, it increased under the baseline, but under this Vision 2050, it decreased. Okay, so quickly, what are the implications of hidden costs? So, like I said before, there's this economic risk, and when you're talking about those very large numbers, aggregate globally, it is potentially a large risk. Agri-food in economic terms is a small sector, but we know that the food system is central to some of the fundamental inputs to the economy, which is labor, which needs to be nourished, and the natural capital base, which agriculture and the food system depend upon and impact greatly. So even though it's a small sector, it has a big effect on all the other aspects of the economy. And this sort of situation where the growth in the deficit to the future may be faster than the growth of the benefits to your society or the value add, if that occurs, it becomes a mainstream productivity concern for nations. It's not just a food system problem then. It gets into the size and scale of things like, that were considered in terms of how we had to make adjustments for demographics. There are huge benefits, but there are also huge potential abatement costs, which is something we hopefully can get to into the exploration. What are the costs of dietary change? They are large, and the challenges for making these progressive. Progressive in an economic sense just means that the poor don't bear disproportionately the costs of the correction, and who pays for the abatement cost is obviously a big question. Implications at the macroeconomic level, we have a full cost benefit, the type of thing you've seen. You also have this idea that some of these benefits in the future are so large you can get into bargaining solutions for externalities, in which case you need strong institutions that can negotiate between the present and the future and can negotiate between the needs of the producers and their financial sustainability and the impacted cost bearers that are across into the future can be marginalized and are across multiple jurisdictions, and that there are transboundary cost bearing in traded goods. So I'm only going to flash up one because of the time, but I think it's an interesting one. A standard thing when you have this sort of cost benefit where you have these future revenues from changing the food system, but you need to make the change now. So this is the type of thing of what treasury bonds are for, that governments invest in making a payment in the future for receiving funds now from broad investors, not necessarily agri-food investors, but any investor that believes the government is going to have those funds in the future. So this gives money to public institutions to try and shape abatement in the food system, which can come through multiple mechanisms that then you have in-sector investors can then invest in like public-private schemes, etc., in some of those adjustments. And therefore you get the change, and therefore you get the booster product in the future, thereby paying for it through this virtuous circle. The interesting thing about this idea is you do broaden the investment base, which is very powerful, and that the risk to the public and the private are completely different. The risk to the public institutions by doing this are achieving the abatement, which will give them those productivity boosts into the future. I'll skip that. That is the idea of hidden costs. And just two quick slides on foresight in and from hidden costs, which you're probably already thinking about. Is future dependence in the estimation of hidden costs. I think you've seen that clearly. It does depend upon scenarios and future assumptions quite heavily. And that when we do this cost benefit analysis, it involves future pathways of food system transformation. which is a very broad scale cost benefit analysis to make the argument for food system transformation. And what are the foresight from hidden costs mean? Is that there are implications for future economies of bearing hidden costs. So we know these states we think about in foresight of obesity, loss of natural capital, but they're actually tied to the economic states. And also this big question of what are the mechanisms to pay for the costs of changing the system? And you can get very different futures and the success or failure of transition pathways depending on who pays the cost to make these food system transformations happen. Okay, thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. And this is super interesting. I think this is really coming at the heart of what a lot of people are involved in this call, when we talk about food system transformation and then also making it happen. And I think this presentation also shows the importance of not only understanding the complexities of the food system and the externalities and the other costs that are generally being generated right now in the form of food system outcomes, such as food security, hunger, but also environmental sustainability and social employment, for instance, but also bringing that dimension about how do we understand that in the future and make that as tangible as possible, in terms of also linking that to modeling and quantitative analysis of these costs. I think that's very interesting. I think I'd like to also request people who have a question to type their question in the chat. If you have any questions, feel free to add that. But I'd like to ask Monica Surek from our Foresight for Food team to give a brief response, a bit of reflection on what we've heard from Stephen, and also link that a little bit to indeed the last element of the presentation about what does this mean for foresight? What does it mean for foresight practitioners? How can we take this knowledge and take this approach forward?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you very much, Bram, also for the invitation to speak here. So just to reiterate, I'm working with Bram and the colleagues in Oxford and Wageningen on the Foresight for Food initiative. And yes, Stephen, I do find your presentation extremely important for the foresight community, because I do think that, so to say, these hidden costs of the transition and change of the food system, both if we don't do anything, but also the costs that it might take to change the system itself, we don't really take into account enough in a lot of the foresight work that is currently going on. I've just been doing a review with some colleagues here for the Foresight for Food initiative to look across 20 really big foresight reports that came out on the future of food, basically since, the beginning of the pandemic up to today. And if we look into a lot of the futures work that has been taking place, the question of these hidden costs. So on the one side, the question of, if we don't do anything, what is the cost to future generation and to our economy and to our planet in the future, as well as the cost of, if we do something, who bears the cost? These questions are not really taken up enough in a lot of the forward looks that we currently see developing since the pandemic. And these have really important implications for the way of how we think about the future. So I do feel that the kind of calculations that you bring to the bear of the global community are extremely important. And they're extremely important for thinking differently about what we need to take into account when we do scenario building, be it scenario building at the global level, as well as at the national and the local level and the community level. And this is here where I really would like to see how, as a foresight community that works both with quantitative approaches, the kind of modeling work that you're doing, and qualitative approaches that works with a lot of communities, be them local communities, be them communities of decision makers at national or local level, that have a lot of pressures on them, often a lot of very short-term consideration, naturally, because there's a lot of pressing problems for food system decision makers on the table these days. But taken really the long-term future cost of a lot of the environmental and social implications that the food system has into account when making a decision, that is still a little bit of a black box, I would say, or a little bit of a gap that we see in the community, and bringing in kind of the quantitative, very evidence-based information that you know, the food system economic condition and the kind of modeling approaches that Stephen is working with can bring to the table into the political economy of decision making and taking the future into account. I think this is where the foresight community has a really, really important role to play, as particular with these different ideas about pathways into the future. We can take up some of this quantitative information and say, what does it mean for our communities that we are working with? And there are a number of approaches that people have already used in this area of bringing qualitative and quantitative foresight together. And I think we as a foresight community can become even more innovative in how we do that, so that we come up with new ideas about the implications of the evidence that Stephen provided and of the modeling work can really be taken into account into the decision-making frameworks that a lot of policymakers are currently working with. So maybe let me stop here and open up the floor for you know, kind of more questions. But I do think foresight can play, qualitative and quantitative foresight together can play a really important role in kind of bringing the message home to the national or local level of what, so to say, the big changes on the horizon might mean for us, and working on these pathways. What does it then mean concretely, the pathways for change? And I think this is where foresight approaches, especially as they bring in a lot of the so to say, the qualitative part of decision making, bring that onto the table, the assumptions that we make about the future. This is where there can be really important overlap between qualitative and quantitative foresight work. So let me stop here and open up the floor to questions, and yeah, happy to chip in with a few more questions myself as we're going along.
Yeah, super. Thanks a lot, Monica. And I think that's really nice that you're really highlighting the implications of these kind of analysis, and how you also get into discussions with stakeholders on this, as well as the mixing of methods, saying, okay, we can take this quantitative approach and perhaps link that especially also to qualitative methods, which are all about sort of engaging with these different stakeholders. And I think that's very nice. There's already some responses coming into the chat. I think it's really nice. Maybe I'll take one or two just to pick it out, and maybe Stephen, you can respond to it briefly before we go into the to breakouts. I think there's a nice comment from Solomon who likes this kind of topic, so that's great. Olga is saying, what about the cost of, for instance, obesity versus topics like starvation and hunger? Is that something that also you take into account in your analysis, Stephen, as well, where you maybe distinguish between Western or high-income countries versus low-income countries? Maybe that's a question for you to think about a bit. And a question from Seren, which is about how can you take these kind of applications into investment processes as well? And has that been done to your knowledge as well? And I'm taking this a little bit in summary, Karen, so correct me if I'm wrong if that's a question, but you're linking this also to international financial institutes. So maybe, Steve, you want to respond briefly to those two questions, if you can?
Yeah, so on obesity and starvation, the thing to understand about the health modeling, in that particular, say, diet scenario, it means eating the right amount of, say, fruits, vegetables, fiber, some of these risk categories where you have this preventative health effect of the diet. So when you're in that particular what-if scenario, in that particular normative scenario where you assumed what the world was like, and you have a vision for it, that meant that those countries were eating sufficient amounts of, number one, calories, and number two, the fruits, vegetables, fiber, healthy diets, which they're not currently able to afford or to utilize or obtain at present, either the right amount of foods or the right amount of calories. So even though it's not said explicitly, there is a removal of hunger. And so you get those benefits from that are counted in. So they're not costed any differently from the benefits of obesity. And the other thing to remember is that there's no costs of treatment in these particular measures because they are about productivity gains. Costs of treatment are exchanges between actors in the economy. So households to the health sector, and they don't get seen by GDP unless that in the future it is not as efficient as a total economy to have such a large health sector and for people to be paying costs in. So that's the thing to remember about trying to compare the different costs between treatments. This is a straight productivity loss, or also called the indirect components, so that all of the costs that are measured are consistent in what they are costing, not just the cost to one group in society, which is the actual people who are bearing the treatment costs. There are other aspects to it. So yes, they are costed. They were costed in the same in terms of the productivity change for that particular study. In terms of the design of investments, no, not explicitly. We are now just trying to introduce this idea, since this idea of hidden costs is sort of growing in awareness. So we are trying to introduce this idea of, cost negotiation between beneficiary pays versus polluter pays, given it's quite a complex thing in the food system we know to implement successful measures. So no, but there has been some work done looked at say subsidy changes in terms of benefits and readjustments in hidden costs, trade-off in hidden costs from that. So in work that's ongoing with the FIO, there is an interest in looking further at these investment things. But I will say with that investment, it's very important to remember here that these beneficiaries are in the future in terms of these things. So when an investor makes an investment now, you have to ask the question, how do they get a return? And there has to be mechanisms that the public body is the custodian, essentially, for making sure these beneficiaries occur in the future, and how to transfer these future benefits to the present, so you can involve investors that should be expecting returns now, because it will just sabotage itself if there are no returns now. And there will be many cases of that. So it's very important when working with this idea of investment that the concept is so clear about where the cost bearing occurs, and where and therefore where the benefits of avoiding occurs, and where the cost of changes in the system are, because they're separated by country, they're separated by complicated biophysical processes, and they're separated by time. So designing the right mechanisms so that you can activate private investment, I think, is one of the key sort of economic intricacies, challenges, or interesting things moving forward in this area.
Very nice responses, Stephen. And I think maybe just to add, what I know is that Asia Development Bank is also increasingly interested in sort of taking into account the hidden costs of the food system in their analyses, and how they want to sort of develop blended finance approaches together with private and public institutions as well. And I think indeed Lisette has been putting something in the chat also about the impact of value of impact investing. So I think there's some things happening here, but perhaps it's still early days. I'm just wondering, like, maybe these questions that are emerging are really interesting. So I'm just wondering if we could take a little bit more time to answer some of these questions, if that's okay with you, Stephen.
Yes,
I think there's
just on impact investing, it's still relatively small. When we're talking about, I know this work done on impact investing, but this concept of double materiality is almost the wrong concept. The future has to be the same materiality. Like the risk for companies has to be the same as the risk to society in the future. That is the way that you design, public intervention. When you start to get value for society diverging from, what all of the individual actors are driving for, that's that's where you get the consequences of imperfect markets, which is we have to acknowledge now that this idea of perfect markets is is a fallacy for these types of situations that we're talking about. So impact investing is still relatively small. The types of change that we're talking about for global food system change and the type of speed that most of us are thinking about in terms of several decades, it requires to activate the whole other sector of not impact investing, but just private investing that is for profit. There has to be profit in this, and to impact the trillions of potential capital raising in these other markets. And it's the government's job to sort of correct the system so that there is profit in this new equilibrium for these first responders and uptaking, and you lose profit for the actors. There has to be losers for the actors that want to just continue the same. And you need funds to adjust that. Where do you get these funds from? That's the big question.
So in this response, I guess, Stephen, this was one of the questions that I wrote down is essentially your target audience for these kind of analyses are mostly governments and basically the big finance players that govern the whole economy. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of use cases for what is called the true costs, true cost analysis. There's so many different levels of user. But what we've been focused on is this macroeconomic case, and GDP is a limited sense of welfare. It doesn't have any sense of distributional fairness to it. So it's very limited, but it's a mainstream indicator. So even though it's so limited, if you can show food system transformation makes a big impact upon it, then you're starting to get through to these sort of mainstream gatekeepers. So that's entirely our focus. We know that it's limited sense of welfare. We know we're missing a lot of things from that list of just taking into account greenhouse gas emissions. There are other things that cause biodiversity loss besides just nitrogen emissions and land use change. So we're not covering all of biodiversity losses from considering only those impact quantities. So we know it's not a complete list. But if it's sufficient to show you have a large change and you can make like a mainstream macroeconomic argument for, that's where this this is what we're targeting with this, or trying to target.
Very nice. Monica raised your hand. Maybe just before we go into that, I'd like to also raise a question from the chat. Richard Banda has written, what about the aspect of food as an important part of identity in society, right? So how important culture is for the meaning of food is critical, and it depends across different contexts, obviously. And how can sort of this economic analysis also take account of that in these models? And then I'll ask Monica to jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, economics it's 200 years of thought. So even though we now see this, mainstream system where we see on the news, people talk about GDP or something like that, the discipline itself has been thinking about value for a long time. And so you will find this rich sense of value, in economic concepts that are now, almost 100 years old, like Pigovian taxation, and this idea of welfare economics is developed in the last 100 years. So as I said before, we know we're being limited, so we're not capturing everything of value. We're really just saying, if we can make a change to this product, and we can notice that with changing the food system, here's another, arrow to the string of, trying to make the argument from many angles. So we're not trying to capture all the value. We're not trying to capture what is the value of human life. Now, in the Food System Economic Commission, we did another type of analysis besides just this hidden cost one. And that was something called a social welfare function, which is can capture a more broad sense of what is goods for people, what is valuable to people. So that's the type of analysis, this broader sense of welfare than just purchasing power, that can capture things like potentially identity, identity loss. It can capture also the value of non-human species to humans. Obviously limited, but it can do more than just something like GDP, which is the value of animal welfare in there sort of reflects more on losses of social license. The impacts already counted from things like concentrated feedlots. There's lots of nitrogen emissions. So there are components in there, but it's not really, a comprehensive sense of value, like I said. So there are ways in economics with these economic principles that are much broader, take much more consideration of what is value than what we're doing here. Like I said, we're very targeted on trying to make a hit to sort of macroeconomic arguments, because there's a whole section of the mainstream that listen to that and look at those indicators. But some of those things can be incorporated and analysis done at that level.
Yeah. No, very interesting. Monica, you can come in.
Yes, let me maybe come back a little bit to the use of this information and how we can maybe bring this into kind of a whole new set of, I think, scenarios work that needs to go on, or foresight work, but more specifically scenarios work that really needs to go on at the national, at the local level, in order to incorporate what all these really super important findings mean for food system change on the ground. So, Stephen, what would you like to see in terms of how we can best use this information in ongoing foresight and scenario processes at the national and the local level? One really important thing in qualitative scenario work is that it helps to challenge the assumptions that we're holding about the future by really understanding very different viewpoints that different groups in society might have, different science discipline bring to the table, to help us really challenge what we thought the future is going to look like versus what the future could look like if some of our assumption changes. I do think that you're really bringing a lot of really important questions on our current assumptions about how the environmental system is going to hold up to the pressures, how the social systems are going to hold up to a lot of existing and new driving forces coming in. You're bringing all of this to the table, and you're even quantifying this to a certain extent. How would you like to see this used best in foresight processes that are ongoing, that we are initiating? Any thoughts of, are there any particular messages and particular methods that you think would be really important we should take into account from your work?
Yeah, I mean, I have one comment, but then I think, the crowd that we have will probably have better answers from me as they start to, think about these costs, and then, take that into account in their own practices, and what they do. So my one comment is perhaps the realization, the value of the foresight work is the robustness of economic solutions. That's not really part of sort of economic cost benefit analysis. There is some representation of uncertainty in there, but that's normally now like transmitted to finance. You look at a lot of risk analysis sort of done in finance, a lot of scenario work. done in finance. But economics still has this sort of very classical deterministic approach to it a lot. And, and there's a lot of, theory to economics, like, taxation will work, that you can say tax the polluters, which in this case are like the producers for their nitrogen emissions, and they'll be able to perfectly transmit those costs upward, to the manufacturers, to the traders, to the retailers, and ultimately to the consumers, so that the whole value chain is bearing the costs of that sort of taxation. And all of those sort of things are not real. And so those theories give you a starting point, like negotiation. And I think some of that exploration in futures about what might go wrong, where you introduce this tax and basically it's just politically unsustainable in 2 years' time. So you have to go back to the drawing board, and you've created all these transaction costs by doing that. I think that's, to me, something that is a valuable contribution of foresighting, is just looking at, the fact that you have to have this whole suite of measures that are all acting imperfectly to try and, internalize some of these costs or change some of these mitigations, under the realization that some of the measures will only go so far. And they depend very much on the situation of the people in that economy and what's going on with their politics or their thinking at that time, and their trends as well. So that sort of potential for robustness analysis, getting stakeholders, participants involved to game whether some of these types of solutions, like border tariffs, border measures, would work, taxes, subsidies, and building through this sort of foresighting a suite of measures, looking at that, realizing the real imperfections because of the complexity of the food system and its heterogeneity, in being able to implement these sort of standard economic measures that have worked in other areas. Because their situation is more simple, there's like a direct line of sight between the people that are producing the costs and those that are bearing the costs. If you're for food safety or something, you can sue the place you ate at last night, right? And so you've got standard policy and regulations, but it comes much harder where, you're trying to sue the people 20 years ago that did something, and they're in another country because, all of their pollution came down the waterway. And that's where you need this, more sophisticated view, I think, of all the imperfections of trying to implement measures, and how it really becomes a mixed bag that you need to implement, understanding the challenges and barriers to it. That, to me, is where, foresighting in terms of implementing these economic solutions, and a portfolio of them, an abatement portfolio of them, could be very valuable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice, very nice. And I think that's also a good link to actually the exercise that we wanted to do together with you all. Apologies on my side. The intention was to have a bit of a breakout to discuss some of these issues. But in the light of the interesting questions that were raised in the chat and the expertise of Stephen, I was thinking that it would be very nice to have this discussion. So apologies for those who are really eager to get into the breakout room. However, I do indeed want to build on what Stephen was saying in terms of how we can conceive of systems change from the perspective of how we do it as Foresight for Food. So let me just share very briefly 2 slides just to get us thinking a little bit about this complexity. And I think the presentation that Stephen gave really highlights 2 things from what we think is really important from that change perspective, that transition perspective, and that basically came out very strongly in that presentation of Stephen, that the complexity of the food system is such that it touches on so many different aspects of society. It's touching on the very fundamentals of the economy, of how societies generate wealth. Even though the economic benefit of agri-food markets perhaps is still limited, it touches on so many different elements that it has an effect across society. And if we want to somehow change the system, we have to think a bit differently about how change would also then occur, right? So we have to think about that often conventional strategies and policies are very linear, that they're very much focused on sort of inputs, action, outcomes sort of logics, where finally a goal would be achieved within a certain amount of time period. And often these plans are quite inflexible. They're not responsive to context, they're not responsive to change as it happens, and thereby also in many ways ineffective, also perhaps because they're only touching on one element of that system. And this is also where also the importance of understanding how change really occurs is really critical. And this is really this picture that we've often shown in our sessions, is about how change really happens. It's a messy process. It has a lot of, like Stephen was mentioning, irreducible uncertainty. Which is, I think, a very interesting and very important term, because there is human action involved, because there's crises, because there's behavior change that's needed across scales, across different contexts, and having that reality being understood, and at the same time then translating back into our strategies, not only now but towards the future, is absolutely crucial. And what we wanted to do with you in this session as well is to unpack a little bit more, like, where do we see system change coming from? What are the elements that are blocking systems from changing, and what needs to change at different levels in order for a system to truly materialize? And we can conceive according to this triangle of food systems change, which was developed by the Water for Systems Change, in the Water for Systems Change guide, which talks about 3 different levels, saying, well, at the structural level, you need policies, you need practices, you need resource flows to change. This talks about, the way trade agreements are organized, the way businesses are conducting their business, the way financiers, for instance, are diverting or investing in certain directions. But at a deeper level, you need to also look at relational change. Can there be changes between relationships between different stakeholders who are not connected, somehow being connected, and also power dynamics to really change? And I think that's also what Stephen was referring to in terms of, can we get a bargaining process going between the present and the future stakeholders to take them into account fully within our current decision making, rather than seeing them as a disconnected type of audience? And then finally, at the deeper level, it's really crucial that transformative change is really taking place, and that talks to sort of a really different way of conceiving of how economy works, how mindsets are indeed crucial to informing all the different actions that stakeholders are taking within the food system space, and how this can be perhaps scaled into relational change, into structural change, to make really transformation happen. So this discussion, I think, also really points to the importance of foresight. So can you use foresight as an approach to get people to understand the implications of policies and practices and resources right now, as compared to what would happen in the future? Can you help foresight? Can you, through foresight, perhaps work on changing mental models, imagining a different type of world in which, for instance, the economic system is very different, and perhaps abates some of these costs? Can we imagine that in order to make it happen? And this is the kind of discussion that we're interested to foster as well. So I'd like to just, leave it there for a bit, and perhaps, ask for a few people to respond with their own ideas and suggestions in the time that we have remaining. I hope that's okay with you, Stephen and Monica as well, because I think we have a rich group here who's able to feed into this. So I'm happy to give the word to people who'd like to contribute. I think there's already people responding in the chat, but if you'd like to say something, please feel free to raise your hand as well. So let me just quickly look at some of the things that put in the chat while people are still mulling this over, perhaps. I think Lisette, thanks once again. Thanks for inviting also the collaboration and how to bundle expertise. So that's also the capacity question. How can we get collective capacities together to tackle this complex issue? I think, Amin is asking about climate policy decisions at country level. We've all seen that President Trump in the US has now come into office. He's signed, I think, a record of 70 plus executive orders on his first day, which includes withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, which is, I think, very much opposite to what many of us would like to see. Bruno, I think you have quite a substantial question. So maybe if you're willing to just summarize that by talking, that's also wonderful. So feel free to speak up. Oh, Stephen, yeah, you want to respond already? Yeah.
Yeah, I read the question, so I can respond to it. In some of this modeling, we're dependent upon the macroeconomic model, and so some of the things are actually treated endogenously in the model. For example, say we didn't have water impact costs in Magpie because Magpie is meant to endogenously, take into account water limitations happening through climate change on, future land use decisions. And they were the major components of the costs we had, was that sort of water scarcity component. So it was already sort of endogenously taken into account how other things like nitrogen emissions, greenhouse gas, habitat loss would change given the scarcity of water. And similarly for things like inequality, on one part, there's the ability of the model that we're working with to actually measure a change in it, because we're quite wedded to, if we're looking at the per unit costs, we're quite wedded to the way that, what quantities can be represented from these models. And number two, we haven't, worked, and potentially there's some future work with the Maragara debt model, which has a great upper capacity. And then I think number two, yes, it's one of the things that we're missing from our calculations, because we don't have representation of the future damages from it. And it's one of the things that we considered, say, with the social welfare approach, because it was a more sophisticated function, so you could represent distributional effects within the social welfare function for the Food System Economic Commission. So you could have complementary analysis that looked at that. So it's definitely something that we're considering. We know that our view of poverty as, say, an indicator of those, damage costs from having low incomes is potentially quite limited, and we know that. So hopefully there are some ways that future things can represent that. Future studies can represent that.
Thanks for that response, Stephen. And I think that's also coming into the details of this kind of modeling, and I think there's different perspectives on this. So thanks a lot for that comment, Bruno. Would anyone like to respond to that question by Amin about what is what are the implications of some of these big decisions that are now being taken by some of these very powerful stakeholders, if we would say the president of the United States itself, as a way of sort of, what additional barriers would this perhaps raise, and what would this mean also for these kind of foresight exercises? Anyone care to respond? I mean, I'm also conscious we have about 5 minutes remaining, so also still interested to hear from others who would like to jump in. So feel free if you want to add. Immediate responses yet? I think this is already a very interesting one. I don't know if perhaps Monica, would you like to say something to this question about Amin? What is the implications for these kind of decisions? I mean, we often talk about foresight having potentially impact on food system transformation, but we also sometimes see the opposite. Like, it seems that the more we know, the more we're unwilling to act and impact. In fact, we think it's all too complicated, and we'll vote for someone like Trump, who very clearly prioritizes the short term over the long term.
Well, and I think this is really the big issue about how do we better deal with uncertainty that you're touching on, which is what foresight approaches were invented to do. Yeah. And there are definitely very different ways of how we can deal with uncertainty, either to focus on the short term, because that's kind of the urgent stuff that's on our table as well. But what we also know is that there are a number of short-term options that might make it much harder in the future to deal with issues coming down the track, and we are putting a lot on the doorsteps of our children and grandchildren in order to deal with. We know this about the environmental crisis. We know this about a lot of the health or equity issues. So there's something that we really need to sort out. But again, this is where foresight approaches both the modeling work that Stephen is doing and the qualitative work with a lot of stakeholders, where it's much easier to discuss these ideas about the future, maybe in a bit of a safe space, can come in helpful to, as you are saying, think about these mental models that we hold about how the future might look like, what the implications are, and therefore what decisions we're basing on. So there is no simple answer. None of the approaches around foresight, of course, can predict the future. But I think there's ways of how we can deal with the fear of the future a little bit better by systematically trying to investigate what the future might hold and what that means for the decisions we're taking today. Again, which is some of the basic ideas behind why we do foresight work in the first place. And I think what Stephen showed us is nevertheless that there are often also blind spots in foresight work that we need to take into account better, new evidence emerging. But that's the beauty of qualitative and quantitative approaches combined, that it can really work with understanding what people think about the future, but also what the latest science evidence helps us in terms of trying to better work with these uncertainties that the future hold. So maybe let me stop here, kind of as my general response to why foresight versus just putting our hands up in the air and say, we don't know, and we just have to adjust.
Yeah, very good. Thanks a lot for that, Monica. And I think that's also a very nice closing remark for this session. Yeah, thanks, Amin. Thanks for the question as well. Yeah, this is really interesting. And I think bringing together different worlds is what we want to do. And also we want to bring forward the action perspective rather than the passive, wait and see type of attitude. And I think that's very, very clear. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this session. I hope you will forgive me for diverging from the planned program, but I felt the questions were so rich that we could have a discussion with Stephen. And I'd like to just thank Stephen again. Thank you so much for joining us here. And the discussion and the presentation was very nice. We will be recording this, of course, so we will also put perhaps the recording of this presentation online so you can share and review later. I'd like to just close with a final slide of sort of thanking everyone for being here. I'd like to also raise that we will be having another webinar very soon. I'm very happy to see Kirsten was with us in this session. I don't know if she's still here, but in any case, we're having a webinar on foresight and policy cycles together with the Fraunhofer Institute on the 11th of February. This will all be about sort of how foresight processes feed into policymaking and how that works and what's the evidence on that. And we're very happy to have that discussion there. If you're interested to know more, feel free to link up to our website at foresightfood.net and sign up to our newsletter. And of course, follow us on LinkedIn. So very welcome to keep that discussion going. If you would like to present some of your own work here, reach out to us and we can think about organizing a webinar with you as well. So I'd like to hereby stop and thank everyone